The knock on my door came at 6:47 a.m. Sharp. 2 deputies stood on my grandfather's porch, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Across the fence line, Karen Morrison, the HOA president from the cookie-cutter neighborhood next door, watched with her arms crossed and that smug look people get when they think they've finally handled you. She had called 911 on me for living in my own damn house. 3 months earlier, I thought the hardest part of inheriting my grandfather's ranch would be the restoration. The warped floorboards, the peeling paint, the chimney that hadn't drawn right since the 1980s. But no, the hardest part turned out to be dealing with people like Karen Morrison, the kind of people who think an HOA badge makes them sheriff of the whole county. When she first came strutting up my gravel driveway, it was a crisp October morning. I was stacking oak by the woodpile, minding my business, when I saw her tennis visor pressed khakis, spotless white sneakers that had never touched dirt. "Excuse me," she called out. "I'm Karen Morrison, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. We need to talk about the smoke coming from your property." I looked at her, then at the chimney. A clean burn, nothing but seasoned oak. "Ma'am," I said, "this property isn't part of your HOA. My family's owned this land since 1903. Her smile tightened. "That may be true," she said, dragging out the word "may like it" hurt her tongue. "But we're all part of the same community. What affects one property affects all." I could almost hear the unspoken words. "You don't belong here." When she threatened to call her friends at the county, I should have known it was the beginning of a war. I'd met her type before people who confuse borrowed authority with real power. I told her politely that we were done talking, and she stormed off, heels crunching on the gravel like gunfire. The next morning, I found out what calling her friends meant. A squad car rolled into my driveway. Officer Martinez stepped out polite but cautious. "We got a complaint about unauthorized burning," he said. I handed him my permit from the county fire department, every box checked, every signature fresh. He looked impressed. "You're all good here," he said, closing his notebook. "Have a good day." Karen watched from across the fence, furious that her plan had fizzled before it started. But people like Karen don't stop when they lose once they escalate. That evening, I started getting screenshots from neighbors. Posts on community boards with photos of my property and captions like "dangerous smoke threatening our children." Karen was leading an online crusade, painting me as some lawless recluse setting fires in a family neighborhood. Within days, I had inspectors from the county environmental officers, even a local news crew pulling up to the ranch. Each time I greeted them with open files, permits, surveys, inspection logs. Every visit ended the same way, no violations found, and every time they left, Karen's frustration grew. That was when I started asking myself, why was she so desperate to get me out of here? The answer came from my neighbor, Tom Hicks. One evening, he showed up with a manila folder full of printed posts, emails, and screenshots. "She's been calling every agency she can," he said. "She's even telling people you're some disgraced cop hiding out here." I flipped through those papers, my anger cooling into something sharper. "She's hiding something," I said. And I was right. See, my grandfather's land sits right against Meadowbrook Estates. Turns out, the HOA had been claiming part of my acreage in their tax filings, using it to get agricultural exemptions they weren't entitled to. Karen wasn't defending community standards. She was covering up a scam. My restoration had brought attention to property lines that her HOA had blurred for years. That night, I called an old friend, Detective Diana Marsh from the County Fraud Division. Off the record, I said, "I think an HOA's been committing tax fraud." There was a long pause, then her dry laugh. "You always find trouble, Ethan. Bring me what you've got." But before I could hand over the files, Karen launched her next offensive. She began filing false police reports, noise complaints, suspicious activity, even a fake domestic disturbance. 7 calls in 2 weeks. Each time the same thing, cops showed up, I showed them documents, they apologized and left shaking their heads. Officer Martinez finally said, "Sir, this looks like systematic harassment. You might want to file charges." I nodded, but said nothing, because I wasn't ready to just survive this anymore. I was going to end it. When Karen sent me a certified letter summoning me to an emergency HOA meeting, I knew she was overplaying her hand. I showed up anyway. The room was packed with angry homeowners whispering and glaring like they were at a public execution. Karen stood behind a folding table suit, pressed hair sprayed, a gavel in hand. "We're here to address ongoing violations threatening our community's safety," she announced. "This man's burning construction and hostility endanger our property values." The crowd murmured in approval. When she invited me to speak, I stood up calmly and laid my paperwork on the table. "This is my family's deed, dated 1903. These are my current permits. My land isn't part of your HOA. You have no jurisdiction here." The room quieted. People looked at each other confused. Karen's smile faltered. "We don't care what technicalities say," she shouted. "Community standards matter more than old pieces of paper." That was the moment I saw it, the crack in her armor. Even her own neighbors shifted uneasily. An older man stood up. "If his land's not in our HOA," he said, "what right do we have to tell him what to do?" Karen stammered, her perfect composure crumbling. I walked out that night knowing she'd just dug her own grave. Of course, she didn't stop there. She called in the County Planning Commission, filed environmental complaints, and dragged a TV reporter back to my gate. But I was ready. Every report, every inspection, every false claim, I documented it all. Then came the big one, the county hearing. Karen arrived in another expensive suit, stacks of binders like she was prosecuting a criminal. Half of Meadowbrook Estates filled the gallery. When the commissioner called the meeting to order, Karen launched into a speech about protecting property values and defending the integrity of our community. When she finally finished, the commissioner turned to me. "Mr. Caldwell, your response." I stood holding a single folder. "Commissioner, everything Mrs. Morrison described takes place on land owned by my family since 1903. This property has never been part of her HOA, and every activity is fully permitted and inspected." Karen interrupted, voice shrill. "We shouldn't let some old deed override the good of the community." The commissioner's eyebrows rose. "Mrs. Morrison, are you suggesting we ignore private property rights?" Karen floundered. "I'm saying community standards should come first." The silence was deafening. I exhaled slowly and said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding about who Mrs. Morrison is dealing with." I reached into my jacket, pulled out my leather wallet, and flipped it open, revealing my sheriff's badge. The light caught the star perfectly. The entire room froze. "My name," I said quietly, "is Sheriff Ethan Caldwell, and I've been documenting Mrs. Morrison's harassment campaign for the past month." I laid 7 police reports on the table. False complaints, defamation, and misuse of county resources. And now, a fraudulent tax scheme under investigation. Karen's face went white. Her hands trembled as she whispered, "If I'd known who you were." I cut her off. "The problem isn't that you didn't know. The problem is that you thought you could treat anyone this way and get away with it." Commissioner Reeves cleared her throat. "This complaint is dismissed as frivolous," she said sharply, "and I'm referring this matter to the district attorney's office for criminal review." The room erupted in murmurs. Karen sank into her chair, staring at me like her whole world had just collapsed. That was the last time she tried to wield her fake authority. The next morning, the county prosecutor opened a case. Fraud, harassment, false reporting, the works. Karen was stripped of her HOA position, fined, and sentenced to community service. Meadowbrook elected new leadership within the month. I never celebrated. Didn't need to. Justice had already done what it was supposed to. Sometimes I still think about that morning, her standing across the fence smiling as the cops pulled up, convinced she'd finally put me in my place. She never imagined I was the law she was trying to weaponize. And maybe that's the lesson here. Real authority doesn't come from a title or a clipboard. It comes from doing what's right, and knowing the law well enough to make it stand on your side.